Easter is upon us. And the reason I know that is that Jane and I just spent over $40 on Easter junk candy for 2 Easter baskets. Secondly, we're beginning to see on church marquees things like He has risen, and we see the typical crosses in the churchyards. But my feeling is whatever you believe, you might be wrong. Now, before I begin this talk, let me offer a disclaimer. I have read this to a couple of people, and they didn't like it. and the comment was, it's too in your face. And my remark, of course, is that's what I do best. And so anyway, I'll leave that up to you. I want to point out that there are some inconsistencies in the typical Christmas story. I think we all have a right to our personal beliefs, whether anybody else agrees with us or not. But there are some inconsistencies in the story and the historical fact. I think everybody has a right to believe anything they want to believe. What I don't like is when somebody basically tells me I have to believe the way that they do. And I think we should all recognize that no matter what we believe, we might be wrong. When you look at the biblical story of the crucifixion and the resurrection from a historical perspective, you find that you are confronted with several dilemmas. The first one that outweighs them all, I think, is, do any of these ancient stories have very much significance on our daily lives in 2016? Paul in 1 Corinthians, that's Corinthians 15 through 17, claims that the resurrection of the Messiah is the single most important concept in the Bible. And it says, I quote, "And if Christ be not raised, your faith is in vain." Well, this is where the first problem arises. Frankly, I liked Easter, and I didn't mind spending the $44 on junk candy. And I don't mind telling you I ate half of it on the way home. But I don't believe in the story. The mainline stories can be found in Matthew 28, verses 1 through 7, Mark 16, 1 through 7, and Luke 24, verses 1 through 10. Most people in predominantly Christian countries are well familiar with the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. Now, we all have to admit that it is a hopeful story. The actual resurrection from dead to life again. And certainly most of us would like to think that there's something really glorious after living our lives and getting old and dealing with all of the issues of aging. It would be nice to have a promise of peace and beauty and freedom from worry and freedom from toil. A kind of a reward for being a relatively decent person. As a species, we have all been told to believe these stories and to hold on to that message. That's the stock and trade of religion, certainly hopeful messages. Certainly the resurrection of Jesus fulfills that longing for something better. Even in the face of contradictory information, we are reluctant to give up our beliefs in these joyful stories. However, I think we are wiser if we know some of the historical facts, and yet we can still believe in the value of mythical stories, even in the face of contradictory information. For example, most of us, we don't have any trouble seeing that the story of the Tower of Babel is a wonderful allegory. When it comes to crucifixion, we see it differently. It could be the fact that the story of Babel is in the Old Testament and it's much older, whereas the story of, it's kind of like the story of Zeus controlling man's behavior. The story of the crucifixion and the resurrection are in the New Testament. The Gospels were composed during and after the revolt of 66 to 74. Rome had fought a very bitter and very costly war against the Hebrews. The Gospels were written years after Jesus' death from oral tradition. So it's easy to understand why there are inconsistencies. For example, were there 2 angels present at the resurrection or just one? Was the stone rolled back from the tomb before Mary arrived or after Mary arrived? We get different versions depending upon what part of the Bible that you read. These questions have caused some infighting in the Christian churches. There are those who claim to be literalist. They believe in literal inerrancy in the Bible. This means that everything in the Bible is without error. It was inspired by God, and therefore there can be no error and no contradiction. This certainly puts them at odds with the more liberal factions in the church. If you would like to read some more on these issues, you might try to read Dennis Mackenzie's Biblical Errancy. Now, I will tell you, you will not find this in a library, and it's quite pricey to buy. Another thing is W.K. Clifford's Skeptical Review. And this is coming out of Robert Funk and the Jesus Seminar. These are people who are really investigating the history, the physical history of Jesus. And some interesting things come out of it. For example, the Jesus Seminar sees Jesus as a normal young Jewish boy. Probably not the firstborn, certainly not divine, and certainly not the Son of God any more than anyone else in this room. He is described as spellbindingly illiterate, an itinerant preacher who angered both the Jews and the Romans, was probably put to death and buried in a shallow grave. So we can easily see how this picture of the factual Jesus differs from tradition. Who's to say which record is accurate and which one is wrong? Small bands of Jesus's followers or the Roman Empire depends upon who wrote the history. So we need to consider both, and we also need to consider the fact that no matter which story we believe, we might be wrong. Crucifixion was a commonly used method of execution during this period of time. It was used by the Romans, the Persians, the Carthaginians. The Greeks used poison, if you just think of Socrates. And the Hebrews used stoning. Vinegar given to a person sounds like a cruel punishment, but vinegar and gall were considered a merciful act. Vinegar at this time was actually a sour wine and would have acted as an anesthetic to deaden pain. It was also used to revive people who were in pain or shock. So now we're faced with a couple of problems. The Gospels say that Jesus was found guilty by the Sanhedrin, and that's the council of the elders, and was turned over to Rome for the sentencing. Okay, here's where the problem comes in. If this is true, it's as though the Jews could not have pronounced a death sentence on a Jew, and this is not the case. It was done all the time, and then the person would have been put to death by stoning. Secondly, the Sanhedrin would never have turned a Jew over to Rome. They hated the Roman Empire, and there was absolutely no cooperation between the Hebrews and Rome. Lastly, they would have had to have met during the time of Passover. This was strictly forbidden by the Jewish law. The Sanhedrin could not meet during Passover, so it would not have been done. The piercing of the side is often seen as an insult, when in fact it was a merciful act, because it would hasten the bleeding and it would ensure a much quicker death. Jesus was in trouble with the leaders of his own religion. He was angry at a corrupt church, so he fought them at every turn. Yet he was not stoned for blasphemy, which would have been typical of the time. Rome had terrible trouble with the Hebrews. It cost them more money to control the Hebrew tribes than it did for all of their other conquered lands. The Hebrew tribes were just a money pit for Rome, because the Jews just simply refused to acculturate. I think that it is possible that a strange alliance occurred because of a common enemy. Both Jesus and Pilate were angry at the Jewish leadership. Jesus broke no Roman law, and yet he was put to death in the normal Roman fashion for people who committed treason. By law, Rome crucified a person for sedition, and it was always done in public. Most often the crucifixions were carried out on the main road leading into major towns. This is evidenced by the Spartan rebellion of 80 years earlier, when 6,000 slaves were crucified on the main road leading into Rome. Yet, Jesus was allowed to be crucified on private land far from any road. And anyone witnessing the crucifixion had to witness it from far off. There were only a few select individuals who were permitted on the site. Interestingly, there's some written evidence that I have found that Joseph of Arimathea was in fact a rich relative of Jesus, possibly his uncle. Also of interest, Joseph of Arimathea owned Golgotha or Calvary, also the Garden of Gethsemane. So it's possible that Joseph of Arimathea arranged for Jesus to be crucified on his private land. Historical records tell us that Pontius Pilate was a very greedy man, not above bribery. He was cruel, but he was very greedy, and certainly some evidence suggests a complicity on his part. Death by crucifixion was very slow, and it was a very painful death. A fit and healthy man would take at least a day or two to die. Some might take as long as a week to die from crucifixion, primarily due to exhaustion, dehydration, blood poisoning, or coagulation. According to the text, Jesus' feet were affixed to the cross. This would have relieved the pressure on the chest muscles. His legs were not broken, and that was usually an act of mercy. So in theory, Jesus should have survived at least a day or two or three. We are, however, told in John 19:33 that he was already dead when his side was pierced. Jesus was on the cross for no more than a few hours, and according to the Gospel of Mark, even Pilate was astonished by the rapid death. That's in Mark 15:44. It was the Roman custom and law to leave the person on the cross until the buzzards had picked the carcass clean and the bones fell from the cross. Jesus was taken off of the cross quickly, and this actually violated Roman law. A crucified man was denied any form of burial, and yet, amazingly, Jesus was quickly taken off of the cross and taken to a private tomb, which of course was also illegal. And it appears that the private tomb was that of Joseph of Arimathea. This was never done for an enemy of Rome. While on the cross, Jesus was given vinegar and gall to deaden the pain. He took the liquid and immediately died. Belladonna was a commonly used soporific drug at the time, and it would have produced the symptoms of death. It's possible that Jesus' vinegar and gall had been laced with opium or belladonna to make it appear that death occurred very quickly. When Joseph asked for the body of Jesus, he used the word soma. This word applies only to the living. When Pilate granted the request, he used the word toma, which means corpse. There are countless reports of Jesus living to an old age. In Kashmir, India, there is actually a tomb that is said to contain the body of Jesus. There are also reports that Jesus died at Masada when the fortress fell to Rome in 74 AD. There are also reports that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and sired a number of children. All of this is perhaps myth, perhaps truth, perhaps a little of both. We will most likely never know the whole truth of it. But we do know that no matter what we believe, we might be wrong. Another interesting fact relates to the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He was a contemporary of Jesus, and he was from his own town. Josephus followed the Roman legions, and it was his job to record the names of every Jew crucified by the Romans. However, he did not record Jesus' name, and nowhere in his writings did he mention Jesus' birth, death, or resurrection. Basically, we have to conclude that historically Jesus had very little impact on his own time. During the period between 120 and 130 A.D., the Alexandrian scholar Basilides committed the most heinous of heresies. He claimed that the crucifixion was a complete fraud and that Jesus did not die on the cross. He further stated that a substitute, Simon of Cyrene, was the person who died on the cross. As late as the 7th century, the Quran maintained the same position, that Simon of Cyrene took Jesus' place. There have been Catholic priests who have written mysterious letters claiming that there is irrefutable evidence in the Vatican that proved Jesus was not crucified. Lastly, and most importantly, from the Gnostic Gospels, specifically the Nag Hammadi scrolls, which in all likelihood are much more reliable than the Bible because they have not been altered. As most of you know, the Bible was pulled from the scrolls in order to present the accurate picture. For example, the King James Bible, King James called 40 of his most trusted people together and told them to give me a Bible that offends the least number of people. And by the way, he was a murderous pedophile. He would have his men bring him small boys. He would rape these children, and then they would be murdered, or he would murder them, so they could not tell what he had done. Anyway, away from that, sorry. In the Nag Hammadi scrolls, the second treatise of the great Seth, Jesus said, and I quote, "I did not succumb to them as they had planned. I did not die, but in reality, but in appearance, lest I be put to shame by them. For my death, which they think happened to them in their error and blindness, since they nailed their man to his death. It was another, Simon, who bore the cross on his shoulders. It was another upon whom they placed the crown of thorns, and I was laughing at their ignorance." Close quote. As you can see, there is conflict between the historical records and the religious beliefs. Notably, there is also great conflict between the various religious interpretations, the church, and the ideologies. Regardless of any interpretation, religious or scholar, human beings have been celebrating the equinox through the millennia. And as for me, that's what I will be celebrating, the equinox. I tend to agree with the German theologian Rudolf Bultmann, who said, and I quote, "It does not make any difference if Jesus never lived. The stories like the Good Samaritan have moral and ethical meaning for all people of all times," close quote. To summarize my own personal opinion, I would say that I am rather agnostic, leaning very closely to being a non-believer. However, I can't rule out completely the idea that Jesus was crucified, because I know that whatever I believe, I might be wrong. In conclusion, I will tell you that my own personal beliefs are much more closely to akin the Dalai Lama, who famously said, and I quote, "This is my simple religion. There is no need for temples. There is no need for complicated philosophy. Our own brain and our own heart is the temple. The philosophy is loving kindness and compassion." So, as you leave today, know that whatever you believe, you might be wrong. Thank you.